Would you mind just sharing a little bit more about yoga, at that level that I think some people might not be aware of? Because we all are familiar with the poses and the physical piece of it, but like, tell me a little bit more about yoga, really what it is and how it's something that can benefit anybody who gets involved with it.
Yeah, so most people get into yoga for the physical. I mean, that's how I got into it. Like you said, doing the ultra running and stuff, my body started breaking apart. And so I needed some movement and some mobility and some flexibility and some stability. And so most people get into it for the physical. And I think that that's like the perfect gateway into exploring the body, but then also getting to a point where when you're in a yoga room, you're thinking about your breath. The teacher is saying things in a different language using Sanskrit and talking about, the yamas and the niyamas, which are these ethical principles that go along with the yoga space. And so you get into that for the physical, and then you start to get exposed to this broader toolkit. And so that's how I like to think of yoga, as this toolkit for life. And so the Indians figured this out thousands and thousands of years ago. And one of the things I find super interesting is how so much of our modern medicine and understanding of how the body, mind, central nervous system, all these things work is sort of catching up with what Ayurveda, which is like they call it the sister science to yoga. Like yoga is the movement and the asana as well as the ethical principles. And then Ayurveda, which is sort of their healthcare system that they had. I mean, and we've definitely updated from 3,000 years ago in the Indus Valley. But then there are all these different cool little things that the modern medical world is sort of catching up with, right? So like turmeric and pepper is really good for inflammation, right? And so we're learning that through science, but the yogis have been doing that for 5,000 years. And so when we talk about yoga starting as the asana, the physical practice, we branch it out as we get deeper and deeper into it. We start to realize that this is how I react when I'm in a stressful position.
Mm.
You're holding a pose for an extended period of time. This is how my breath feels when I want to get out of the space that I'm in, right? And so that applies to being in a meeting or being working with your kid or being in a public speaking setting where you're like, okay, this is what my heart's doing. This is what my lungs are doing. This is how my voice is. I've been here before, right? And so the asana practice gives us a tool. The physical practice, asanas. Asana means the seat in which the yogi sits. And so the practice was originally a practice designed to get the body in shape to be able to sit for extended periods of time, so that the mind could then dive deeper and go through the layers of like, this is what a human mind is like. And so when we explore the asana and we get deeper into the asana, we realize that we can be in difficult positions and breathe our way through it and work our way through it. And so the asana is a tool, and it opens up the rest of the practice to us. So yeah, it's a toolkit. It's this massive toolkit that covers, spirituality is a word that has a lot of like hangups on, right? And so sometimes depending on what space you're in, we do or don't use that word. But Sam Harris, who's a writer, has a lot to say about the idea of spirituality in a secular sense. And so I approach the yoga practice very secularly, meaning, without a lot of the religious connotations, because I don't think you need it, because the tools are there, right? The tools can be approached in a way that doesn't have those things. But so the toolkit it's a fully spiritual practice. It's a fully physical practice. It is a mental practice. There's a word in yoga in Sanskrit called svadhyaya, and that word means self-study. And so like when we're listening to podcasts like this, talking about the introspective podcast, I mean, you could call this podcast the Svadhyaya project. Nobody would know what you're talking about, but it could be called the Svadhyaya podcast, right? It's this introspective, this reflective, this is what it's like to be inside of me right now, watching that person do those things, right? So
Yeah, and the thing about, especially going back to the name of this podcast being introspective, is, I think as entrepreneurs, we're very introspective people. At least I am. And I had spoke with somebody recently because he were like, tell me about your podcast, who you're serving. I always start with like, this podcast is really an extension of myself, because as an entrepreneur, I'm very introspective, and having that toolkit to kind of help you understanding how to navigate, I think, through that introspection of thought and feeling and everything that's going on. It sounds like yoga gives you that. It gives you that toolkit. And especially one of the things you mentioned that I like to ask you about a little bit further here in detail is how it can help you really with like stressful situations, right? Kind of getting through some stressful situations, whether it be for some people, I think like, I don't know if you've ever heard this term, it's kind of thrown around. It's called imposter syndrome, where you're thinking about, you're in the online space and you're thinking about starting a podcast or starting a YouTube channel, or you're wanting to put out your course or be that thought leader, and you're sharing your thoughts, but there's that moment of, I'm afraid to do this, or I'm afraid to, put myself out there. What are people going to say? Like, is that something that you feel like in that yoga toolkit? Like, is there some benefit to that imposter syndrome or to that fear, with having the ability to kind of tap more into that introspective of who you are, understanding, what's going on with your feelings, your thoughts, that being that you have? Is there something there that you think can really help people through those moments of fear as they're going through business and trying to kind of hit some of these milestones of growth?
Yeah, yeah. I think that there's a word that we use in the yoga world called centering. And so centering yourself before any sort of challenging thing, whether it's whatever it is, a meeting, just going into work some days because of however things are shaking out, or meeting with a client, whatever it is. In the yoga world, we call it centering. And so that centering could be anything from like just like a steady, solid breath. It could be sitting in your car for an extra 2 Mississippi in silence and just kind of giving yourself a moment to flutter the thoughts away. So I say all the time, the heart breathes air, the the heart beats, the lungs breathe air, and the mind thinks thoughts. And so those thoughts are going to flutter and they're going to move. And if we can take a moment and center, then hopefully they'll start to settle, right? And if it doesn't, the next move is to sort of start to move the body. So when we get in these anxiety states, we find that the body starts to react. And so in meditation or in movement, we can notice when we're nervous that we're feeling it somewhere. Some people feel it, their hands shake a little bit. Some people, their voice shakes. Sometimes it's the heartbeat. Sometimes it's the guts, right? And so if we can start to move the body, then we can get out of the body a little bit and start to settle the mind, right? So it could be taking laps. It could be like, I did some push-ups with one of my students the other day because he was feeling a little bit nervous, right? So it could be any of those things. And I would say in the yoga space, tangentially associated with that, in the yoga teacher trainings that I teach, we use a method called nonviolent communication created by Marshall Rosenberg, which has definitely made its way into the business world as well. And so I would change that to needs and values based communication. And any person, whether you're in business or whether you're just a person living your life, I would strongly advocate that you establish what your values are. What are the things that you value? And so as a business, you can have your values as like, this is what my business values, right? And as an entrepreneur or as a person or an employee, you can still have those values. And so for me, my number one value is autonomy. My second is growth. And my third is authenticity. And so when I meet people like you, Jake, and like you're resonating with all this stuff, like that's like, I don't know how we didn't meet 10 years ago. Do you know what I mean? Because like we have these values in common. And so when I have those values established for myself, what I can see is in my communication with my wife, communication with my students, communication with business and business relationships. If I can filter those communications through those values, are my needs and values being met? And if not, how can I find those needs and values being met somewhere else? I think those are huge. So centering yourself, finding a way to kind of tool down and using breath work, which I know you'd said you're going to have some people on the podcast talking about breath work specifically. There is a smorgasbord of different tools in that toolkit. Moving the body, even if it's not a yoga practice, walking, right? Push-ups. A yoga practice would be great if you can carve out an hour from your day because it does all of the movement that is necessary. And then 3 is establish your values. What do you value, right?